So we are going to talk about ensuring voting access across the electorate, and I will start out and then turn it over to my colleagues. In a well-functioning democracy, all citizens have equal and easy access to the voting process, but some groups currently face higher barriers to voting, and the electoral system should be designed and administered to lessen those barriers. Our team reviewed existing evidence on the impacts of higher barriers to voting faced by several important groups in the United States, including areas where the barriers overlap. We reviewed best practices and suggest improvements to election systems. And we identified areas where new research can most fruitfully be directed. This presentation reviews the work that we've done with respect to the following groups: people with disabilities and senior citizens, which I'm going to talk about that in a second, Native Americans with Jean Schroedel, rural citizens with Cameron Wimpy, and college students and young adults with Dan Smith. Looking at people with disabilities and senior citizens, we're combining these groups for these purposes because there's a lot of overlap between them, and many of the barriers faced by people with disabilities are also experienced by senior citizens. We know that there's lower turnout among people with disabilities and that they face greater voting difficulties. And this report assesses evidence on voting barriers in the following areas. Lower internet access, which affects information access on the voting process, transportation barriers and costs in registering to vote and getting to polling places, problems in registering to vote, physical access to polling places, being allowed to vote, especially if the polling officials perceive or assume that somebody with a disability has a mental or developmental disability and is incapable of voting. The usability and accessibility of voting systems and other voting materials, the value of voting by mail, but the difficulties that are still encountered by some people with disabilities, especially people with visual disabilities, required assistance in polling places and voting by mail, treatment by election officials and poll workers, and voting system guidelines in process of catching up with new technologies. Looking at priority areas for further research, we identify new voting technologies and systems with an accessible universal design approach, the impact of changes in state-level voting laws and policies, also the impact of specific election administration practices and procedures on the ability of voting independently, the availability of accessible voting systems, including the number of accessible voting stations that are needed, election official and poll worker training in maximizing independence and privacy of voting by people with disabilities, policies and practices on signature matching and curing rejected ballots, and access to voting information for people with disabilities in institutions such as nursing homes, assisted living facilities, and jails. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jean Schroedel.
Thank you. Native Americans only received U.S. citizenship in 1924 with the passage of the Indian Citizenship Act. And it took another 50 years before the Voting Rights Act began to be enforced in Indian country. This history continues to be a huge issue for Native Americans. It contributes to very high levels of political distrust of government officials, including those responsible for administering elections. Native Americans have lower registration and turnout rates than other populations, although that disparity is lessening. They also have high rates of rejected ballots, both provisional and absentee ballots, again, something that feeds into distrust. One of the biggest issues currently affecting Native Americans is the switch to voting by mail. When distances to polling places or polling places are great, voters typically embrace voting by mail as an option, but that is not true for Native voters. Most reservations do not have residential mail service, which means that people must travel to post offices to get and receive mail. When faced with having to travel long distances to vote, Whether it's going to polling places or to post offices, they typically stop voting. When asked by survey takers to identify access issues for registration and voting, Native respondents placed travel distance at the very top of the list. They also identified a series of other issues, including the need for poll workers and election officials to be more sensitive to the cultural needs of Native voters by showing respect, particularly to elders, ensuring that people are able and willing to assist voters with limited English and those who only speak Native languages. And finally, accepting tribal identification, oftentimes with non-traditional addressing. We identified a number of priority areas for future research. First, developing a database with the locations of drop boxes, polling places, and postal locations for counties that have reservations. Second, looking into the purging of voter rolls, which some have asserted is a problem that particularly affects Native voters. Third, identifying poll worker recruitment and education strategies that have been developed to address some of the problems that have been identified. And four, to extend the research that is done beyond reservation populations to look at the specific issues that are affecting urban Indians, who we know have very high rates of homelessness and non-voting.
All right, so I looked at rural residents in this section of the paper. So we're looking at assessing evidence and suggesting solutions on a variety of things. First, starting just with a general lack of focus on the rural dimension to election administration, despite the outsized impact, given that while less than 1/5 of voters live in rural areas, more than 2/3 of election officials administer elections in rural areas. So there are a variety of challenges to administering elections in rural areas that involve, in some cases, large counties with not a lot of support, very difficult access on roadways, and sometimes polling sites spread away out across a county, multiple county seats where things have to be administered by administrators. So a variety of challenges there. In terms of the voter experience, it's often the case that voters are quite trusting of rural election officials, but outside of that, their experience is quite a bit different than it is in urban areas, and we talk about that. Some discussions about election performance between urban and rural jurisdictions, and then issues related to accessibility that apply to rural areas in general with less funding and support for those types of things. And then a bit of discussion about the pandemic and the recent climate around elections and how that might be affecting rural officials. In terms of looking at priority areas for future research, certainly measuring the rural-urban dimension is very important, and there are a variety of ways to do that have been established in other fields, but how we apply that to election administration and election science is an important question. And there are things to look at there with respect to exactly what level of jurisdiction we should be measuring, because in many places it's the county, in many places it's smaller than that, and how do we put all that together? Continuing the discussion about whether a one-size-fits-all approach to laws makes sense for a situation where the country is so diffuse with rural areas. We have 20 years of Hobbin now, and some of those pieces that looked at that early on, that discussion probably needs to be revisited and continued now that we have lots of data on it. And then additional qualitative efforts to better understand the experience of administrators in rural jurisdictions and how they interact with their voters and what that means for voting in those areas.
We took a look at voting of college students and young adults. There's an extensive literature showing that younger individuals, including those attending college, are less likely to turn out to vote than their elders, despite an array of election administration reforms targeting youth turnout. In the 2020 general election, an election with historic high turnout, the turnout rate for citizens aged 18 to 29 was over 25 percentage points less than citizens 60 and over. Why is this the case? Why do younger voters face differentially higher costs and barriers to voting. They're particularly vulnerable to some of the costs because, in general, younger voters have less political knowledge, exhibit lower political efficacy, and possess fewer socioeconomic resources than older adults. They have, by definition, fewer opportunities to become habituated to voting. They lack many of the resources that can promote participation, as Eric Klutzer noted over 20 years ago. They're less likely to own a home, more mobile, less disposable income, and have less meaningful community engagement in general. By definition, younger voters lack electoral experience. They're more likely then to incur an experience penalty or an inexperience penalty, as some refer to it, leading to more rejected ballots, more provisional ballots rejected, and less political representation. Is it a surprise that younger voters take less advantage of electoral reforms, as some scholars have recently said? I think so, but there are barriers to these folks, particularly those waiting to vote on election day. We need more research on the effects of changes of polling locations and how they affect younger voters disproportionately, the transportation issues to get to polling sites, and of course, voter identification, particularly in states that require students to re-register or have strict voter ID laws and proof of residency. There are also problems with younger voters having their ballots counted. I think more research needs to be done on casting of provisional ballots and the rejection of those ballots, especially for younger voters. And we also need more research on looking at those who have attended college or university and those who do not. We see that under mobilization from Survey of Performance of American Elections shows that both college educated and those non-college educated youth face similar challenges: too busy or conflicts on election day, more inconvenient hours, and less and more long lines at the polls. So what are some of the suggestions for improvement? There's really now quite dated research on portable and pre-registration laws, especially with a lot of the changes. Very dated research on polling locations and mailing of sample ballots, extended voting hours, and those costs on young voters. More recent research on same-day registration and how it affects younger voters. But all these areas, and then particularly with the expansion of no-excuse mail voting and all mail ballots, we need more research on how do younger voters face the structural challenges of moving with temporary addresses, the non-forwardability of ballots, and the timeliness of return mail ballots. The scholarly literature is growing. It hasn't caught up with a lot of the policy reports that document these challenges and successes with youth voting, but we look forward to future research on the topic.
Well, thank you everyone for your interesting presentations, and we welcome questions and feedback.